first thing that he looked at during this analysis was breaking the investors into two categories. The first category is going to be new investors. So the people who have never invested in a deal before, once they actually invest, they're designated as a new investor. The other category is returning investors. So these are the people who were obviously originally new investors, but they've either come back, for a second deal, a third deal, a fourth deal, etc., etc. So the first thing he looked at was the total number of new investors versus the total number of returning investors on the deal. And he determined that approximately 70% of the people who invested in the particular deal that he did a breakdown on were new investors. And then obviously the remaining 30% were returning investors. But one interesting thing that he did that maybe most people wouldn't have done, but it's a more important metric than just the absolute number of new investors versus the absolute number of returning investors, and that is the proportion of capital that was invested by these two groups. So of the entire money raise, how much of that was invested by new investors and how much of that was invested by returning investors. And when Joe did his analysis, he determined that the returning investors actually invested more than the new investors. It wasn't by much, so it was actually 49.6% of the total raise was from new investors and 50.4% came from the existing investors. So before we get into where these people came from, Joe had two important takeaways from that. Number one was that a new investor is likely not going to invest. Now, there's obviously some cases where they do, but they're most likely not going to invest as much as a returning investor. So this particular deal, even though 70% of the total number of investors were new, they only accounted for 50%, a little bit under 50% of the total raise, whereas the returning investors accounted for 30% of the total number of investors and invested 50% of the total equity raise. What does that mean? Well, that means that we should be focusing on the new investors, getting new investors, of course, because those new investors are going to ideally become returning investors. But the goal should be to retain as many investors as possible. So when you do your first deal, 100% of those people are going to be first-time investors. And throughout the business plan, you're doing all of your other asset management duties. But one thing you should be focusing on is what can I do or what should I do in order to maximize the total number of returning investors? What can I do to maximize the number of investors who come back for my second deal? And just off the top of my head, I can think of a few. We've definitely talked about this a lot on the Syndication School series, but number one is going to be transparency. So if something goes, just as an example, if something goes wrong at the property, whether it be some sort of physical issue where there's a fire or a flood, if you are not hitting your occupancy projection, if you're not hitting your rent projection, the first thing you need to do is make sure you let your investors know. But before you let your investors know, you don't want to just say, hey, we're not hitting our occupancy goal, or our occupancy rate is 80% when you projected 90%. You want to also include the reasons why it's so low or so high, depending on what the metric is, and then what you plan on doing to fix it. And even better, you're already in the process of implementing that solution. So if it's an occupancy issue, you can say something along the lines of, the reason why our occupancy level is below our projections is because of XYZ. Maybe there's a property nearby who's offering some sort of rent special. There's plenty of reasons why occupancy could be below. And then right now, our plan to fix this is to do XYZ. So if it's the rent special at a neighboring property, you would also offer a rent special as well. Maybe it is you creating a specific marketing plan that's your property management company, and you both create for you to increase marketing spend by offering a referral program, maybe doing some corporate outreach, maybe printing off some flyers and dropping off at local businesses, things like that. So transparency is obviously important. Number two is going to be to make sure you're conservatively underwriting your deals. That way you won't run into you'll minimize your chances. You minimize the risks of running into some sort of issue with your projections versus the actuals. So if you're aggressively underwriting, then you're more likely going to have the actual performance of the property be off from your projections, which is going to be an issue, especially if there's nothing you can do to fix it because of the incorrect projection. So there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different things you can do to make sure you're retaining your investors. Those are just a few examples, but overall, it's just do what you say you're going to do, and you should be fine. As long as you say you're going to do X and you do X, as long as say you're going to distribute this much money to them and you do it on time. If you're making sure you're replying to emails quickly, things like that. Just pretty normal things that really anyone would do common sensely when raising money from people.